Hello and welcome to part 4 of Reconstruction, and this is where we're going to be talking about Reconstruction by Congress and how Congress pretty much takes power of Reconstruction under Andrew Johnson. And as we talked about before, is we left it off that Johnson's was very unpopular. He was more supportive of the Democrats than either the conservative moderates or radical Republicans at the time, which made him unpopular. He also begins making a lot of allowances for the South, as well as he pretty much shows that he wants nothing to do with African Americans or anything to just to allow kind of things to remain the same just without slavery. And how that really offended a lot of the Republican Party. And you see the Republican Party come together and strengthen. And so that kind of leaves us where we are. As we talked about that in the 1864-1865, Johnson had systematically alienated the Republican Congress. He'd begun by April and May of 1865 as a promising relationship, as someone who was going to work with the radical Republicans and Republicans in general. But by the end of 1866, it was noticeable that the relationship had soured. And we will discuss kind of the final break and how Congress seized control of Reconstruction by 1867. And this is really the congressional blueprint for states to rejoin the Union, and the importance of the presidential election of 1868. We'll see that as well, which sent Ulysses S. Grant to the White House. So first we need to kind of discuss a little bit about the ratifications of the 14th and 15th Amendments. And remember, we talked about the great Civil War amendments, which are the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. The radical Republicans gained more power in the election of 1866, and Johnson tried to put in place the Union Party, a conservative Republican / Southern Democratic Party, but it failed by 1866, and the Republicans ended up taking control of the Congress and the Senate. And by 1866, they had kind of moved past, had another phase with Johnson, and this is really a phase where they have triumphed, and they have enough strength to overturn a lot of Johnson's policies. And in 1866, the North was fully behind the 14th Amendment, but 4 Southern states needed to ratify it for it to become a law. So, and I made a mistake in the last lecture. I said it was 5/6. It's actually 3/4 of the states that have to ratify. And in the future, I'll correct that. So it's 3/4 of the states, and unless and the problem was that they needed 4 Southern states, and they needed to readmit the states to get that. Because they worried that if they didn't have those 4 states, if they didn't have the South in that the ratification of the 14th Amendment would be unconstitutional. And they could go around it by changing the law that they didn't, in fact, need 3/4 of loyal states to do it. But again, that was that fear that it would be unconstitutional and it would backfire. So the Republicans became in favor of the amendment, but they still needed it. They needed, the question was, how are they going to get enough votes? President Johnson, on the other hand, went around discouraging the 14th Amendment. He actively campaigned against it. He said that all the Southern states needed to vote down the 14th Amendment. And all the Southern states did vote it down, except the one great irony is Tennessee. Tennessee, Johnson's home state, was on board with the amendment. And through Johnson's stubbornness and his white forward policies, it ends up becoming a final straw for the both moderate Republicans and so the radical Republicans joined force with the moderate Republicans. And so what they look at is they need to rebuild the South from the bottom up. And how can they do this? How can they tap into how can they tap into more votes? And so what they end up doing is they look to the new they look for African American support. That's what they do. They look for particularly Southern African American support, and they say, if we're going to rebuild the South, if we are going to determine what is going to be the Constitution, what we need to do is we need to look at that African American vote. And so, as one Southern Carolinian individuals said this was madness, and it was madness and the most infamous revolution in history. And it really was. Today we don't think of having African Americans, men or women, voting as being really radical. But when was there equality? In the United States, at the beginning of the United States, there was voting, but it was only for white males who were land owning. And then later that gradually changes. And in fact, previously women did in some colonies have the right to vote. And when they first formed statehood, they did, and it gradually was removed, particularly in New Jersey, and I believe it's in Massachusetts as well. Women had right to vote, in Maine. They had the right to vote, and that was taken away. So instead, what ends up happening is, when do you have equality? It is only a white male-dominated vote. No other minorities did. So this is really radical thinking, and it had never happened before. So this is why it's so strange. But in March 1867, Congress passed two congressional acts. The Reconstruction Acts the Reconstruction Acts in 1867. Johnson vetoed both of them. So the second session of Congress, the 39th Congress, which had been elected, remember, in November of 1864, the first session had been between December 1865 and 1866, and the second session began in December of 1866 and would end in March 1867. They wanted to accomplish something out there because nothing was going through, and so they wanted decisions that would made, and they have the great debate, and they were even willing to fuel by compromise to get something done by March. And so the Congressional Act of 1867, what it did is it nullified the states' governments and governments in all of the former Confederate states except Tennessee. Remember, Tennessee ratified the 14th Amendment. They divided the South into 5 military districts and decided to impose military rule. And the third part was the legislation said that the state, if they wrote new state constitutions, which would allow the remittance, the ratification of the 14th Amendment, as well as the acceptance of African American suffrage, would be allowed back. So there's 3 for the Congressional Act of 1867. First, the nullification of all of the Confederate states except Tennessee. The second is divided the South into 5 military districts imposed by military rule. And legislation said that if the state could form a new constitution which allowed the 14th Amendment as well as black enfranchisement. The Second Congressional Act of 1867 ordered military commanders to begin enrolling African American voters. The second was disqualified about 10% of the potential white Southern voters, allowed 90% of them, but disqualified 10% of them because of the Civil War involvement. And then they also wanted to limit Johnson's ability to remove appointed officials from office unless they had senatorial approval. Now, this is really important, and this is known as the Tenure of Office Act. So, again, the Second Congressional Act in 1867 first ordered military commanders to enroll African American voters. Second, disqualified 10% of potential white voters in the South, allowed 90% of them. And the third, and probably the most important out of that, was remember, these are all vetoed by Johnson. And so what it limited Johnson's ability to appoint officials, to remove appointed officials from office without the Senate's approval. And this is known as the Tenure of Office Act. Now, the Tenure of Office Act was particularly to support Edwin M. Stanton, and his life dates are 1814 to 1869, who was a radical and supported radical programs of Reconstruction. It was often at odds with Johnson. Stanton was first served under President Lincoln. Now, the Tenure of Office Act also limited Johnson's control over the Army. Remember, they just formed, they wanted to form military districts. Johnson vetoed the Tenure of Office Act, but it passed over Johnson's veto. So people worried even that this act was kind of unconstitutional in itself, including the Republicans. It seemed to infringe on constitutional powers, particularly that the president was the commander-in-chief of the army. But the Republicans were now in control. The Republicans were now supported by African Americans, and part of the Republicans, the Republican Party was known for in the South as being the party of the blacks. This is really the development of carpetbaggers and scallywags, which we'll be talking about in our next lecture. And so what one of the fears was the process of impeachment was that if Johnson challenged the Tenure of Office Act, if he tried to remove it, there was a big fear, or deemed it unconstitutional and violated it, there was definite, people began talking about impeaching President Johnson. In the process of impeachment, the House impeaches, the Senate convicts. So that means the House can bring up impeachment, they have to vote on it, but the Senate actually holds the trial. And so the grounds of impeachment, according to the Constitution, has to have a crime or a misdemeanor. High crimes or a misdemeanor. The moderate Republicans of the party were frustrated that Johnson tried to remove the Tenure of Office Act, and they also were frustrated that Johnson hadn't broke any laws initially. So the radicals' impeachment process, they were saying if Johnson violated the Tenure of Office Act, it would be grounds for impeachment, and they could get rid of Johnson. And so Johnson wanted to try to test the constitutionality of the Tenure of Office Act. So what he ends up doing is he removes Stanton. And his argument is that since Stanton was appointed by Lincoln, and he didn't personally appoint him, that means that he could remove him without fear of violating the Tenure of Office Act. Now, this leads to his impeachment. And now, this is kind of where people were worried that, again, that this wasn't a constitutional act. And so, did Congress, was it violating constitutionality? And so, was this a way of a political framework versus illegality that he's removing this? Anyway, what ends up happening on February 24th, 1868 is the House votes 126 to 47 to remove Johnson, to impeach Johnson. So they move in favor of impeachment. Now, the question is, what happens if Johnson is impeached? Well, Benjamin Franklin Wade, remember from the Wade-Davis bill, it would be next up in line for president. Because Johnson had stepped in from the vice presidency, Wade was the president pro tem of the Senate, which means since there was no vice president, that's where he was staying, or that's where he was. A lot of Northerners didn't like Wade. He was seen as kind of a fire eater, which means he was very radical at the time. He was part of the radical Republicans. And they really worried that if a radical Republican became the president, that it would that the moderate Republicans who were just, remember, on board against Johnson would lose a lot of power, and they were fearful of how Reconstruction would be. So with a Reconstruction, 11 charges were brought up against Andrew Johnson. 8 dealt with the removal of Stanton, and the other 3 was really is the frustrated will of Congress, that Johnson was impeding in the political process by vetoing everything that they were passing. So on March 4th, 1867, the trial began in the Senate. Now this is highly... Johnson's counsel impeachment said, yes, he did violate the Tenure of Office Act. It was indictable in a court, but it wasn't criminal. And Johnson had very good lawyers. His whole argument was hey, I didn't appoint Stanton, so I should be able to remove him. And this is, and Johnson's lawyers also say, hey, this is a political oust because he's not following what the Republicans want. It is not a legal, or not a criminal crime. And so this trial goes on. It is highly watched. Everyone's excited. Anytime there is an impeachment trial, it is particularly of a president. The stands are very full, and this was considered the highlight of entertainment at the time to go and see. Both sides got a lot of jabs. And the trial lasted for 11 weeks. It was very popular. Galleries were packed, and Congress and the president were a hot ticket. And like I said, there was a big fear of what's going to happen and what also the precedents would be. So if Johnson is impeached, does that mean that a president could be impeached if Congress has a majority in the opposite party and does not like it? Or does it need to be of high crimes? And so this went back and forth. What are we going to do if we removed? Does that mean that any time a president had a sitting Congress of an opposite party that they could get removed? And it was a big fear. So the final vote ended up happening, two-thirds majority to convict, but the radicals failed by one vote. And it actually was a swing vote by a fellow Republican who was afraid of Wade. It was a 35-19 vote. All 12 Democrats and 7 Republicans were voted for acquittal. Both moderates and conservatives thought it was bad. It was going to be a bad precedent to set, saying that if we don't like a president's behavior, we can just remove him without any crimes against. Johnson agreed to uphold the Reconstruction bills, and Johnson was considered prior to the impeachment as a very radical guy. He was very loud. He was a big stump speaker, which means you literally get on a stump and you shout and stuff. And that's how a lot of elections were run at this time, is people would find stumps and stand on it. He was blatantly racist, as I said. He didn't care. He would say constantly, didn't give a damn about what people were saying. But during the trial and after the trial, he was quieter. He was calmer. And so the Senate that was trying him noticed that, and they said, maybe this is a change, Johnson. Maybe the threat of impeachment would change. So what should they do? How should they proceed? And so that is really what is the fall, the fear of Benjamin Franklin Wade becoming president, and this idea that we have a quieter Johnson who may fall in line. And so that is how Johnson's impeachment trial went. And the next section we'll be talking about kind of Reconstruction in the South, particularly with Black laws, the myth of Black rule, and how more of a social instead of a political Reconstruction is about. Okay. I hope you enjoyed the lecture.